Back to Dan Seeley's Financial Issues, and that little disclosure also goes for us, Jeremy. Fred Jackson and Jeremy Wiggins sitting in. Our opinions are our opinions.
Yes, they do not represent Dan or the ministry or anything else, as you'll hear at the end with the disclaimer.
There you go. All right, we've been talking about our guest who is joining us from France this morning, Larry Taunton of the Fixed Point Foundation. And Larry, are you with us?
I am indeed.
Welcome. Whereabouts in France are you?
I am in the south of France, a place called La Bastide. Don't think Provence. Nothing quite like that. We're in what's called the Black Mountain, and we're excited to be here and excited to talk to you.
Excellent. Thank you for joining us today. Now, you have been doing some research on, and I'll call them church kids who grow up in church youth groups. And you have been puzzled by their departure from their faith in later years. And why don't you tell us about that research and what you have found out?
Sure. The research isn't exactly church kids, though. I understand why it might seem like that, and many others have sort of taken that from our study as well. The reality is at Fixed Point Foundation, the ministry that I direct, and I of course do a fair amount of writing, and you refer, Fred, very generously to the article that I wrote for the Atlantic called "Listening to Young Atheists," and we've done an awful lot of work with atheists by individuals like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and some of the faces of the so-called new atheism, as well as with students. And we decided a little over a year ago to just sit down and talk with them, these students, undergraduates who belong to atheist organizations, and just ask them about themselves and ask them about their journey to unbelief. Tell us why you don't believe. Tell us not only why you don't believe, but why you actively do not believe. I mean, not only do you not believe, you've joined a group of atheists, and it's become a kind of church for you. Tell us about that. And so we sat and began listening to hour after hour after hour of interview with these students. And what we discovered, Fred, was that a lot of these kids, much to our surprise, came from the church. Not all of them, by any stretch of the imagination. There's one or two that would not apply to, but we began to notice a theme of students who had belonged to churches or who had grown up in churches and who'd walked away from it. And so it really became a very interesting series of interviews with students who did not believe in Jesus Christ and had embraced unbelief and why they embraced it.
Now, you mentioned, or at least in this article that we have in front of us from the Christian Post, which quotes you as mentioning, for example, a young man by the name of Phil. And
sure.
he left the faith, if we want to use that phrase. He was involved with the youth group, but it had to do with a change in youth pastors at his church.
That's right. The article I wrote is called "Listening to Young Atheists," and it's in the Atlantic, June 6th. And then Eric Metaxas wrote the article that you're referring to that's in the Christian Post,
right,
which is an article about my article. And Eric is a friend of mine and graciously references that piece. He found it fascinating. And the names that we use for these students are all fictitious.
Mm-hmm.
Part of our agreement with these students was that we would anonymize them. We wouldn't give away who they really were. And so this young man that I call Phil, his was the very first story that we heard, and I was riveted, because here comes a guy into my office, and he's a little distrustful to begin with when I tell him that, because he knows who I am. He knows that I'm an apologist, as Christians say. I'm a defender of the Christian faith, and in some sense, maybe somebody he might perceive to be an enemy of what he believes. But he did agree to participate, and he came into my office, and my staff gave him a nice meal, and we chatted a little bit. And then I began asking him questions, and I think when it dawned on him that I really did not intend to debate him, I just wanted to listen to him. I just wanted to hear his story. I found myself thinking a time or two, Fred, if I'm him, I'm not sure that I don't think the same things he does, given his experience. He talked about growing up in a church where he loved his youth pastor. He loved his pastor. He loved studying the Bible. He loved going to church. And I had to even remind myself I wasn't listening to a young man talking about the people who had inspired him to go to seminary. This was a young man who was an atheist. And so when I began, asking him, well, now hold on. I mean, you're talking about how much you loved your church and so forth. I was prepared to him to talk about how much he hated church and hated Christians and this kind of thing. And that wasn't what he said at all. He said that how much he enjoyed his church, but he felt betrayed by his church. He felt that his church became more interested in really just trying to get more people into the church, more people to raise money. They became less interested about the Bible. They became less interested in teaching it. They fired his youth pastor, somebody that he loves very much. And I almost think that he embraced atheism as an act of rebellion against that particular church and the way he felt that church had betrayed all that was important to him. Granted, we're only hearing one side of the story. Perhaps if I listened to the pastor of that church and maybe some others in that church, I might hear a very different story. But we tried to hear these stories at face value and understand their journey as these students themselves understood it.
Larry, this is Jeremy here. It's been my experience in having talked with youth before, college-age kids who walked away from the faith. It seems to me like we've made this switch from a disciple-mentor relationship that used to be between a youth pastor and a student, and now he just wants to be his pal. I mean, they've started dressing like them. They start using the lingo. They start, doing all of this stuff to try to
and worship the culture.
Yeah, they instead of being a person who this young person should be looking up to, they try to lower themselves down onto their level. When really, in my opinion, these youth, they want somebody they can look up to, somebody they know they can go to, and they can answer these questions biblically about what they're going through in their lives, not trying to live that life with them. And they want somebody who's going to ultimately stand by those convictions so that, they can turn to them when they struggle and not view them as somebody who's going through the same thing that they are.
Well, Jeremy, I think you've got a very good point. Though I don't know that the students would ever articulate it that way or even agree that what you just said is true, even though in my experience, some 25 years of youth ministry, I can tell you that I think that's true, meaning I don't know that they set out looking for that, or at least knowing that that's what they're looking for, knowing that's what they need, but it is something that they respond to. And you touch on another theme that we saw in these interviews, and as I said earlier, I was prepared to hear a bunch of kids talk about how much they hated the church and how much they didn't like Christians and so on and so forth. And for the most part, that just wasn't what we heard. What we heard were students who, many of whom were wounded, in an emotional sense, not necessarily by their churches, but by life. These were often people who were very bruised in some sense, had some rather traumatic experiences. Many of them came from broken homes. Others had some abuse in their background, and these were often kids who expressed a tremendous amount of respect for those Christians who took the Bible seriously. One young man that I interviewed at a prestigious institution on the East Coast, he said, and I quote him in the article, he said, I really can't consider a Christian a very good person, a moral person, if he isn't trying to convert me. And, that jarred me, honestly. I mean, that you might say that, or that Fred might say that, or I might say that is not shocking, but that an atheist would say that. And so many of these students talked about how much respect they had for their Bible teachers and for those Christians who really believed the Bible.
It's interesting in this.
Conversely, let me throw this in. Pardon me for 1 second. But as a corollary, many of them also expressed a real disdain for what you and I might call liberal Christianity, meaning that those youth pastors or those pastors or those organizations that endeavored to be so ecumenical as to be really not real clear on whether they believed anything, were the kinds of individuals and organizations and churches for which they had no respect. And again, there may be some exceptions to that in the individuals that we talk to, but these are some themes that we saw repeated again and again.
If I could summarize in what I understand from what you've just been talking about, Larry, is that we know the Bible is black and white on the critical issues of our day.
Sure.
Thou shalt not is pretty clear. But what's happening, if I understand your thesis in all of this, is that in an attempt to be more pleasing to the world, we're watering down the message, and these kids are saying the message can't mean much. It can't really be the truth if you're willing to compromise so easily.
Well, I think that is certainly one of the truths that we can take from it. And yet I would also say this. You and I would probably have thought that and felt that for any number of churches that we would consider to be, again, I just use the phrase because it's convenient, a kind of liberal Christianity that seems very permissive in everything and doesn't really seem to stand much for anything. But I also think that there's a lesson here to be learned, a very powerful, important lesson to be learned here for churches that we might say are very strong evangelical Bible-believing churches. And that is this, that I do think that there are those kinds of churches, those kinds of Christians, those kinds of ministers who are very faithful to the Word, but who believe kind of in their bones that they're really just polishing the decks on a sinking ship. You know, that I'm going to remain true to this, but of course, you know, I feel kind of like Isaiah. You know, I'm going to just keep proclaiming it, but nobody's really listening. And there are instances, perhaps, where that is true. But one of the very powerful takeaways I get from this is that you really should take encouragement from the fact that there are those who respect that kind of Christianity more. And indeed, I think that we'll discover that the sorts of things that gave rise to the Reformation, to the Great Awakenings, and indeed to perhaps one in our own generation, is that these were people who unashamedly proclaimed the truth of the gospel. And sometimes we think that we're doing God a favor or we're doing ourselves a favor by not really bringing him into the conversation very much, or by being a little bit shy about what we believe and who we are and why we believe it. And our study kind of gave us the opposite impression. And so I think that's a very important takeaway. Another important takeaway that we really learned from this is that these, by and large, were very reasonable, likable kids. Some of them we've even managed to get into our Bible studies. And they've had a good time. Many of them perceive Christians, and I'm not sure that I should say that they're wrong about this. They perceive Christians as people who are all too ready to present answers, who are often all too ready to argue, but who don't listen. And the real key, I think, to this article's popularity, honestly, this piece went viral, and it kind of surprised me. I was pleased that The Atlantic published it. At the moment that I'm speaking, it's been recommended on Facebook 43,000 times, and it's become The Atlantic's second most popular piece in the digital age. Now, why is that? Well, I think that the answer to that is that word listening. Christians and non-Christians alike became very fascinated with this piece and with this study because it was a study about listening to people that we don't agree with. And very frequently, we're ready to argue with people we don't agree with. We're ready to condemn people that we don't agree with. But we're very seldom willing to sit down and close our mouth and just listen to what they have to say. And I discovered that through this, I learned a very important lesson, and that is in many instances the great ministry that we were able to do through this.
Larry, we only have about 20 seconds left. I'm so
just
sorry.
Listening.
Yes. Larry Taunton, Fixed Point Foundation, thanks so much for being our guest today.
Well, thanks for having me.
All right. God bless. You're listening to Dan Seeley's Financial Issues. Have to take a break for the news here. We'll be right back.